There is a figure who walks between worlds, unseen by most, understood by few. In the mythology of the psyche, there exists a rare archetype that Carl Jung himself might have recognized, though he never named it directly. The Sigma INFJ. Not merely introverted, not simply intuitive, but something altogether more elusive. These are the individuals who have learned to navigate the depths of human consciousness while remaining invisible to the surface world, carrying within them what Jung called the shadow, that repository of everything we hide, everything we deny, everything we fear to acknowledge. The ancient Greeks spoke of the oracle at Delphi, who dwelt in darkness to see truth. The Sigma INFJ dwell similarly, not in physical caves, but in psychological ones, and what they discover there transforms them into something most INFJs never become. These are not the warm advocates the personality frameworks celebrate. These are the ones who have descended into their own underworld, and returned changed, carrying secrets about human nature that others would rather not face. 7 hidden traits mark this transformation, 7 signs that distinguish the Sigma INFJ from their more conventional counterparts. These are not quirks or preferences. These are revelations of a deeper psychological architecture, one built from solitude, shadow work, and the courage to see what others refuse to witness. The first trait emerges from what Nietzsche called the pathos of distance, that psychological space the superior individual maintains between themselves and the herd. The Sigma INFJ has mastered what we might call strategic invisibility, but this is not the social anxiety of the typical introvert. This is calculated, deliberate, almost predatory in its precision. Where the ordinary INFJ withdraws from overwhelm, the Sigma INFJ withdraws from choice, creating a perceptual gap in which they become functionally invisible, whilst remaining physically present. They have learned something profound about human attention, that it flows towards certain patterns, and away from others, and they have trained themselves to occupy the space where attention does not naturally fall. In mythology, we find this archetype in figures like Odysseus, who told the Cyclops his name was nobody, and disappeared into the linguistic void. The Sigma INFJ performs a similar vanishing act, not through deception, but through the absence of conventional social signals. They do not seek attention, they do not broadcast their presence, they do not emit the energetic frequencies that draw human notice. In a room of 50 people, they become the 50th person you would remember, not through lack of presence but through an abundance of control over how that presence manifests. This invisibility serves multiple functions simultaneously. It creates a laboratory for observation, allowing the Sigma INFJ to witness human behavior in its unguarded state, when people believe themselves unobserved. It establishes a protective barrier against the constant demands of social performance that drain most INFJs. It generates a kind of psychological freedom, the liberty to move through spaces without the weight of others, projections and expectations. But most profoundly, it reflects a decision about power, specifically, that true power lies not in being seen but in seeing, not in being known but in knowing. The ordinary INFJ struggles with this invisibility, experiences it as loneliness or rejection. The Sigma INFJ has transmuted it into an advantage, recognizing it as the natural camouflage of the psychological predator, who hunts not for harm but for truth. The second trait flows directly from the first, and reveals something darker still. The Sigma INFJ has developed what Jung would recognize as integrated shadow perception, the capacity to see clearly the shadow elements in others, whilst maintaining awareness of their own. This is not the naive idealism often attributed to INFJs, nor is it the vision of human potential and goodness. This is something far more unsettling, the ability to perceive human darkness with clinical precision, whilst feeling neither judgment nor horror. The ordinary INFJ sees the best in people, sometimes to their own detriment. The Sigma INFJ sees everything in people, the light and the shadow equally, and has learned to accept both as necessary components of the human condition. In Plato's allegory of the cave, most people live-chained, watching shadows on walls, mistaking these projections for reality. The philosopher escapes, sees the true forms, and returns to the cave with knowledge the prisoners cannot accept. The Sigma INFJ performs this journey repeatedly, not once but continuously. And what they discover is that the shadows on the wall are not distortions but revelations. That human behavior in its unguarded moments tells more truth than human words, in their most careful constructions. They observe the small cruelties people inflict without awareness, the unconscious manipulations, the petty jealousies and territorial games, the ways human beings use and discard one another, whilst maintaining elaborate fictions of care and connection. Where this knowledge might embitter others, the Sigma INFJ experiences something closer to clarity. They understand that these shadows are not aberrations but features, not bugs in the human system but essential code. This perception manifests in unsettling ways. The Sigma INFJ can often predict human behavior with disturbing accuracy, not through mysticism but through pattern recognition applied to shadow material. They know what someone will do before that person consciously knows it, because they see the shadow motives that precede a conscious decision. They recognize the specific texture of different deceptions, can distinguish between the lie someone tells to protect themselves, and the lie they tell to harm another. They perceive the invisible hierarchies in any social group, who genuinely holds power, and who merely performs it, who is the predator, and who is the prey. This knowledge creates a profound isolation. The Sigma INFJ cannot unsee what they have learned to see, cannot return to the comfortable fictions that lubricate social interaction. They become like the character in Greek mythology, who could see the fates weaving, who watched as the threads of human lives were measured and cut, powerless to intervene but unable to look away. Yet they have learned something the ordinary INFJ has not, that acceptance of human shadow is not cynicism but realism, that seeing darkness clearly is the prerequisite for genuine compassion, rather than its opposite. The third trait marks a departure so complete from typical INFJ behavior, that it often goes unrecognized even by those who display it. The Sigma INFJ has developed what we might call ethical autonomy beyond conventional morality, a personal moral framework constructed independently of social consensus or institutional authority. This is not rebellion for its own sake, not the adolescent rejection of rules, simply because they are rules. This is something far more profound, the recognition that conventional morality is often a system of control, rather than a system of ethics, that what society calls good frequently serves power rather than truth, and that genuine ethical behavior sometimes requires the courage to stand outside the moral consensus entirely. Nietzsche spoke of the distinction between master morality and slave morality, between ethics generated from personal power, and ethics imposed by institutional authority. The Sigma INFJ has discovered this distinction experientially, often through witnessing the ways conventional moral systems fail to address genuine human needs, or actively cause harm while claiming benevolent intent. They have seen how moral language can be weaponized, how concepts like fairness and justice become tools of manipulation, how ethical appeals often disguise purely selfish motivations. From these observations they have constructed something unusual, a personal ethical system, based not on rules but on principles, not on obedience but on integrity, not on social approval but on internal coherence. This manifests in behavior that confuses those around them. The Sigma INFJ may violate social conventions while maintaining rigorous personal ethics. They may refuse obligations that others consider sacred, whilst holding themselves to standards far more demanding than social norms require. They operate from what Jung called the ethical instinct, that deep knowing of right action that precedes and supersedes codified morality. In mythology, we find this archetype in figures like Antigone, who buried her brother in defiance of state law because a higher law demanded it, who chose death, rather than compromise her understanding of right action. The Sigma INFJ makes similar choices, though usually in less dramatic contexts. consistently prioritizing internal ethical coherence over external social approval. This creates particular challenges in a world that demands moral performance, the visible demonstration of conventional ethical behavior. The Sigma INFJ may appear amoral to those who equate morality with social conformity, when in fact, they are operating from ethics too rigorous and too personal to be legible within conventional frameworks. They refuse to perform moral outrage they do not feel, decline to participate in collective punishment rituals, and resist the pressure to adopt political or ethical positions simply because their social group demands it. They have discovered what Socrates knew, that the unexamined life is not worth living. But they have extended this principle to recognize that the unexamined morality is not worth following. Where the ordinary INFJ struggles between their personal values and social expectations, often attempting to reconcile the two, the Sigma INFJ has resolved this tension by simply abandoning the need for external validation of their ethical framework. They know what they believe is right, have tested these beliefs against experience and reflection, and require no consensus to proceed. This grants them a particular kind of freedom, liberation from moral peer pressure, but it also marks them as dangerous to systems that depend on ethical conformity. They become the individual who asks uncomfortable questions in moral conversations, who refuses to participate in collective moral certainties, who points out the shadow hiding behind righteous pronouncements. The fourth trait reveals the Sigma INFJ's relationship with knowledge itself, specifically, their development of what we might call omnivorous intellectual consumption, combined with radical epistemological skepticism. They do not simply read widely or think deeply, though they do both. They have cultivated a particular approach to knowledge acquisition that treats all sources as potentially valuable and simultaneously suspect, maintaining what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to dwell in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. The ordinary INFJ often becomes attached to particular frameworks or belief systems, finding in them the coherence and meaning their intuitive function craves. The Sigma INFJ moves through frameworks like a ghost through walls, extracting what serves whilst remaining fundamentally uncommitted to any single interpretive lens. They might study Jung and Freud, Marx and Nietzsche, Buddhism and neuroscience, finding value in each, whilst recognizing the limitations and biases inherent in every system of thought. This creates an unusual intellectual profile. The Sigma INFJ often knows a disturbing amount about subjects far outside their formal training, has read primary sources in multiple disciplines, and can discuss philosophy, psychology, mythology, and science with equal facility. Yet they resist the label of expert, understanding that expertise often means narrowness, the deep knowledge of increasingly specific domains at the cost of a broader vision. They prefer what Renaissance thinkers called the polymath ideal, broad knowledge across domains, combined with the capacity to perceive connections invisible to specialists. In Borges' story The Library of Babel, readers wander through infinite corridors seeking the book that explains all other books, the master key to universal knowledge. The Sigma INFJ has abandoned this search, recognized that no single framework contains truth, that reality is too complex and multifaceted for any one interpretive system to capture. Instead, they have become comfortable dwelling in what William Blake called contraries, holding contradictory ideas simultaneously, allowing tension between competing frameworks to generate insight, rather than demanding premature resolution. This intellectual approach manifests in conversation as something that can unsettle others. The Sigma INFJ may argue multiple sides of a question, not from indecision, but from genuine appreciation of the validity of different perspectives. They resist conclusions, preferring to dwell in the question itself, circling problems from multiple angles rather than rushing toward answers. They become frustrated with ideological certainty, particularly the typical pattern where people mistake their interpretive framework for reality itself, rather than recognizing frameworks as tools for thinking, rather than descriptions of truth. Where the ordinary INFJ seeks knowledge to build understanding and connection, the Sigma INFJ seeks knowledge as its own end, valuing the expansion of perspective even when, perhaps especially when, that expansion generates more questions than answers. They have learned what Socrates taught, that wisdom begins with the recognition of ignorance. But they have extended this principle into a kind of permanent intellectual humility, paradoxically combined with voracious intellectual ambition. The fifth trait touches on something most people prefer not to acknowledge: the Sigma INFJ's development of what might be called a comfort with human expendability, their recognition that not all relationships serve growth, and their willingness to sever connections without guilt or extended grieving. This is perhaps the most shadow-tinged trait of all, the one that most clearly separates the Sigma INFJ from the warm, loyal, relationship-focused profile the personality frameworks celebrate. Where the ordinary INFJ forms deep bonds and maintains them through difficulty and distance, often to their own detriment, the Sigma INFJ has learned something colder and perhaps more honest. Not all connections deserve preservation. Not all relationships serve a genuine purpose, and the courage to release what no longer functions is a form of psychological hygiene rather than callousness. In nature, trees in forest systems share resources through root networks, supporting one another through underground connections, invisible to surface observation. But trees also recognize when another tree is dying, when resources flowing toward it will not generate return, and they sever those connections, redirecting energy toward growth that remains viable. The Sigma INFJ has learned this arboreal wisdom, developed the capacity to assess relationships with clear eyes, and release them when they cease to provide mutual growth, or when they actively drain resources needed elsewhere. This manifests in behavior that others often interpret as coldness or cruelty. The Sigma INFJ may end friendships abruptly after careful consideration, withdraw from family systems that prove toxic, and terminate romantic relationships when incompatibility becomes clear, rather than persist in hope of change. They do this not from a lack of feeling, but from clarity of purpose, understanding that their energy and attention are finite resources that require strategic allocation. They have rejected the cultural narrative that loyalty means endurance regardless of cost, recognizing that this narrative often serves those who benefit from others' continued tolerance of mistreatment or misalignment. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, and recognized that this process requires separation from collective values and expectations. The Sigma INFJ extends this principle to relationships themselves, understanding that sometimes individuation requires releasing connections that keep one tethered to outdated versions of self, or that demand conformity to expectations inconsistent with authentic development. They become willing to walk alone, rather than compromise their trajectory for companionship, willing to accept loneliness as the price of integrity. This creates a particular kind of isolation, not the loneliness of the unwanted, but the solitude of the selective. The Sigma INFJ often has few relationships, but those they maintain meet stringent criteria, offer genuine reciprocity, support the authentic self rather than convenient performance, and challenge growth rather than enabling stagnation. They have learned that quality of connection matters more than quantity, that 10 surface friendships provide less nourishment than one relationship of genuine depth and mutual recognition. Where the ordinary INFJ fears abandonment and works tirelessly to maintain bonds even when those bonds have become chains, the Sigma INFJ has conquered this fear through the recognition that they are fundamentally complete alone, that relationship is an enhancement rather than a necessity, and that they can survive and even thrive in solitude if required. This realization liberates them from the desperate quality that mars many INFJ relationships, the subtle neediness that comes from treating connection as an existential requirement, rather than a chosen luxury. The sixth trait reveals the Sigma INFJ's relationship with power itself, specifically their development of what we might call stealth influence. the capacity to shape outcomes and affect systems whilst remaining invisible within them. This is not the overt leadership that personality frameworks sometimes incorrectly attribute to INFJs, nor is it the visible direction others give toward shared goals. This is something far more subtle and potentially more effective: the ability to plant ideas, shift perspectives, and alter trajectories through minimal intervention at maximum leverage points, all whilst ensuring that others experience these changes as their own insights, rather than external influence. In game theory, there is a concept called the kingmaker, the player who cannot win themselves but can determine which other player wins by strategically allocating their support. The Sigma INFJ often occupies this position by choice, recognizing that visible power attracts resistance and responsibility, whilst invisible influence provides impact without cost. They have studied how systems actually work rather than how they claim to work, have mapped the informal power structures that underlie formal hierarchies, and have identified the true decision-makers versus those who merely exercise authority. With this knowledge, they become capable of extraordinary, subtle intervention. The Sigma INFJ may whisper a single question that reshapes someone's thinking, may introduce one connection that transforms an organization's direction, may withhold support at a critical moment, causing a project to fail that needed to fail. They do this not through manipulation in the toxic sense, but through a clear perception of what outcomes actually serve, combined with the tactical intelligence to bring those outcomes into being. In Chinese philosophy, water is the supreme metaphor for power. Weak in appearance but wearing away stone, through persistent, subtle pressure, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly, filling whatever container it enters whilst maintaining its essential nature. The Sigma INFJ has learned water's lessons, become fluid rather than fixed, persistent rather than forceful, patient rather than aggressive. They recognize that the person shouting instructions rarely holds true power, that the one quietly observing and occasionally suggesting often shapes outcomes more effectively than the one attempting direct control. This approach to influence creates particular advantages. Because the Sigma INFJ remains invisible, they avoid the political attacks and resistance that visible leaders face. Because their influence appears organic rather than imposed, it encounters less psychological resistance. Because they frame their suggestions as questions rather than directives, they bypass others' defensive responses to being told what to do. They become what intelligence services call a grey person. Someone who can operate in any environment without triggering an alarm, someone whose presence and influence fade from memory, even as their effects persist. Where the ordinary INFJ often struggles with feelings of powerlessness despite their strong vision for better outcomes, the Sigma INFJ has resolved this tension by abandoning the need for credit or recognition, understanding that impact matters more than attribution, that shaping reality beats performing authority. They have learned what Lao Tzu taught, that the best leaders are those whose existence the people barely notice, who lead so skillfully that when the work is done the people say, "We did this ourselves." The seventh and perhaps most profound trait brings us full circle, back to the shadow that opened this exploration. The Sigma INFJ has achieved what Jung considered the goal of psychological development. Still, few actually accomplish genuine integration of their personal shadow, combined with acceptance of the collective shadow, that repository of everything humanity refuses to acknowledge about itself. This is not the superficial shadow work that has become fashionable in pop psychology, the cataloguing of minor flaws and socially unacceptable impulses. This is the deep work, the confrontation with everything they are capable of, everything they have been, everything they could become if circumstances shifted. The ordinary INFJ often maintains an idealized self-concept, seeing themselves as inherently good, oriented toward helping others, and motivated by pure intentions. The Sigma INFJ has shattered this comforting fiction through ruthless self-examination, has discovered the parts of themselves capable of cruelty and manipulation, has acknowledged the ways they use their perceptiveness as a weapon, and has accepted their capacity for coldness and calculation. They have looked into what Nietzsche called the abyss, recognized that when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you, and they have not flinched from what gazed back. In mythology, the hero's journey requires descent into the underworld, confrontation with death and darkness, before return and transformation can occur. Inanna descends through 7 gates, shedding her power at each threshold, until she arrives naked before her shadow sister. Orpheus, entering Hades, seeking what was lost. Dante guided through the inferno, before ascending toward paradise. The Sigma INFJ has made this mythic journey psychologically, descending into their own depths, meeting what dwells there, and returning changed. What they discovered is that the shadow contains not only darkness but power, that the traits they were taught to suppress often hold their greatest strength. The coldness becomes clarity, the calculation becomes strategy, the capacity for manipulation becomes the ability to influence for good. They learned what Jung knew, that integration does not mean eliminating the shadow, but bringing it into conscious relationship, directing its energy, rather than being directed by it. This integration manifests in a particular quality of presence. The Sigma INFJ radiates a kind of completeness, a psychological solidity that comes from having confronted and accepted all aspects of self. They are not performing goodness or virtue, they are not hiding their darkness behind social masks, they are simply being what they are fully and without apology. This creates both comfort and discomfort in others. Comfort because authenticity is recognizable and attractive. Discomfort because it highlights the performance and fragmentation most people live with daily. The Sigma INFJ becomes a mirror in which others see their own avoided shadows, making them simultaneously magnetic and threatening. Where the ordinary INFJ often remains fragmented, presenting different versions of self in different contexts, and exhausting themselves with the effort of maintaining these separate personas, the Sigma INFJ has achieved integration, becoming whole, even if that wholeness includes elements others consider dark. They have learned what Carl Jung spent a lifetime teaching, that wholeness comes not from perfection but from completeness. Not from eliminating darkness, but from accepting it. Not from becoming all light but from acknowledging that light and shadow together create the whole human being. In accepting their own shadow they have become capable of accepting humanity's shadow, can look at human history's horrors without flinching, and can acknowledge human capacity for extraordinary cruelty without despair. They understand that the same species that creates art and philosophy also creates concentration camps and genocides, that human beings are capable of both transcendent beauty and appalling ugliness, and that denying either capacity distorts understanding of what we actually are. This knowledge does not embitter them, though it easily could. Instead, it deepens their compassion, not the naive compassion that expects people to be good, but the mature compassion that accepts people as they are, shadow and light intertwined, and works with that reality rather than against it.